Hello, hello. Are you there? Are you there, Toby?
I think so. Can you hear me?
I think so.
We end up here.
I know, just like in tiny little boxes, just like looking at our own faces all evening. Fantastic. Well, God heaving to you and welcome to the launch of Toby Fitch New Buck Sad Nice Spleen. May known as Justin Clemens, hand high hope been tusked with the Joe-filled Jew tie of sighing hey few weirds, the boot teas po hums, calming toe you feed, unseeded lands of Nam. As you know, Toby is to be considered one of Australia's beast-livered pots. Eastprey via box include the Magivy Sensticks, Rorschach, which roars and shucks in equine mesh air, Geraldaries, hay litters of all lordishness, and ill-lit pop, in which chew, who all of curse hath been all more eyes, the weird huff the pot bile art, would recognize his characteristically flanerish deconstructions of the matery tiered of weeds, hair death, compose, fishing, and reconstruction, hinto, tree anti, het tea, call homophones of themselves. Gelstars, Baudelaire, wand-haired, the ruse of barren house man's paradise, in the mid-9th century, singeing the destruction, hand disaster of some itch devo, lotment, these implementation of modern nitty through the obliteration of what X is. Thick rowdies drivelling through the bowl evades by the whip of pledge air. Toby Wandares, the Straits of Squidney, blast turd by COVID like a neutron bum. In Thistle, out, rage again, the twerks of Gotterdammerung. Toby unleashes his so splay emetics again, steed colon. Jarl sight indicates hit new phantom Magori, hits hell sights the toxic city beneath this park hall, the absolute Leorden hairiness of the chronic dis, eases the logics of Kronos, the bond, I bitch Babel, evil flow ers, the gap be between pots and the prolet, hair at the air airs of the globe, all precare, he in at nude irks, the compress, shun, hove, pandemic, thneed reams that reef use their power, size hay shone the gleam up the pol, ute head sun. The hammy let nightmare of the lost food budgets, the vice chance hell, or the chance hell, or huff vice, give you in you yeti not her mass age, the pendants of the wen of the wend, sparklings and satiety, handkin ties, housing bub bulbs, and plan head up souls, the roll east hair show, and just the genie roll gist of the plague times that be Cetus. As Baudelaire puts hit, hat east in Walter Martin's English translation, when the poet comes by sovereign decree to live among us in this worn-out world, his mother shakes her fist, her blasphemy against the loving God is uncontrolled. Nobody can affirm the pot or pots or pottery figures of circle or shun and protest against the masters hat roll over at us, except in so far as thrall dead hatch themselves from hexitch agencies of the God sends of the present, handmaid, igni hences, the guels of poor and no leggy. So he dances like a butterfly, stings like Toby. Please welcome Toby Fitch. Hello, Toby. Good evening to you.
It's Justin. Good evening to you too.
I believe you're going to begin with a poem, Toby.
Oh, am I? Thank you first. You hinted at doing something like that for a launch speech. That was pretty wild to mock my poems like that, using some of the same sort of techniques, and it's a bit of an honor, really.
Well, imitation's the sincerest form of flattery, Toby.
Yep, it is. I should probably do a couple of thank yous before launching into poems as well. Thanks to Ursula and Luke for reading tonight. Obviously, I'm a fan of your poems, but there's something, I guess, there's an aesthetic quality of, I don't know, like a coruscating kind of effect that goes on in your poems that builds up. And I like to think that I aspire to some of that quality in some of my poems too. Not that it always comes off. Thanks everyone for tuning in. I liked the idea of a late night poetry gig. That's how we came to be here on a Friday night. Rather than the sort of 6 o'clock, 7 o'clock dinner poetry readings. And it's also great to see family and friends and colleagues and strangers in those little Space Invader icons at the bottom there, and in the chat. Thanks for all the congrats and stuff. Yeah, I'm obviously a bit nervous. Haven't been the subject of a live public conversation like this before, so bear with me and my embarrassment. But yeah, before I get to the poems, have a few acknowledgements and thank yous. I'd like to acknowledge the Wiradjuri people on whose land I'm tuning in from. I'm actually in Albury, in my partner's mother's study, and Dorothy Simmons is an Irish-Australian novelist and short story writer for adults, young adults and teenagers, and deserves to be more widely read. So thank you, Dottie, for letting me use your writing place while we've got our family in your home. As to this thing, I'd like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I wrote all the poems in this book while living in Newtown on those lands. I'd like to thank everyone at Giramondo for believing in my cranky poems. Ivor Indyk, of course, Nick Tapper for pulling people on and off screen in this crowdcast thing. Alicia Paz, who's hosting tonight. Thanks for hosting and organising and for proofreading so well my book. And Lisa Gordon for her editing expertise, her suggestions on all our conversations. And thanks also to Chris Edwards for his editorial advice. He's been a long time close reader of my work. And finally, I'd like to thank my partner, Frankie, and our daughters, Evie and Tilda, for obviously their love and support, but also for putting up with the poems that are autobiographical. Yeah, that's the thank you. So maybe I should acknowledge the submarines, the nuclear submarines that the government bought, which they used to, they stated submarines are the spaceships of the ocean, didn't they?
They did it, and it's 30 years till they arrived too. So look, you know, a lot of expectation attending to those submarines. But you're not a submarine at the moment, Toby, are you? You're like your poems are wandering around Sydney. Perhaps you could start with the spleen that Sydney induces in you.
Okay, I'll just go with the first poem, which is called Spleen 1. There are four poems titled Spleen throughout the book, and there are four poems titled Spleen by Baudelaire. And so all my four ones are very loose translations of his. And this is number one of those. And it goes, oh, I should mention that the Minky that's named in this is my very, very aging black staffy. That's probably all you need to know. Spleen 1. January, pissed off with Sydney, pours steaming torrents on the lessees of Camperdown Cemetery and mortal dumps on the tenants and landlords of suburbia. Tiles offer scant comfort to Minky, her failing back legs splayed out like a frog's for maximum chill. Tiny Kafkas haunt the hot drains, squeal as they're turned into ghosts by raid. A siren grieves summer, its miasma of smoke, fire. A mosquito hums falsetto to this end of days catarrh. Meanwhile, some other apocalypse drops biblical ice on Canberra, and invisible solar coronas eating battered lungs for breakfast disinter whole centuries of fear. Yeah, moody. Yeah, mean start to the book, I guess.
It really is. You know, as Baudelaire, as we mentioned before, was wandering around Haussmann's Paris in the mid-19th century, where all the entire destruction of the and of course gave rise to the very famous figure of the flaneur. I guess you're flaneuring yourself in Plaguetown at this point, or was this just, even though it's a very depressing poem in some ways, or at least a biting poem about the apocalypses that beset us. Was this just prior to COVID when you wrote this? Is this a pre-COVID poem or an in-COVID poem?
It's an in-COVID poem. Yeah, I mean, it was kind of, yeah, there was a bit of a, sorry, my daughter's just entered the room. Say hello to everyone, Evie.
Hi, Evie.
I mentioned in poems. Off you go. I've got to keep doing this.
Got to keep talking. He's got a job.
Darling.
What's the internet?
I think there are about 7 or 8 other people in the house that should be looking after her. Anyway,
They're all watching you on TV, Toby, hopefully.
yes, they are, which is all very embarrassing. But yeah, where were we? What were we talking about?
Talking about, yeah, Plaguetown. Sydney is Plaguetown.
Yeah, so I mean, most of the poems were written during the pandemic in this book. I mean, there are a handful that go back like 5 years, but they've been sort of sitting on my computer in a folder called Sydney Spleen, and so the idea's been there for a while, but I just couldn't get anything to work really. But I guess there were some, you know, a lot of things to talk about, a lot of things to write against, like the poems. I guess I started putting poems in there that were changing in my work. So there was like a lot more realist poems, a lot more politically overt, urgent kind of poems. Just increasingly autobiographical, like my last book, Where Only the Sky Had Hung Before, sort of did a lot of that. It's not like everything I write isn't autobiographical on some level, but like
much more explicitly so, and more realist too, would you say?
Yep, more realist. Yep. You know, there's also the naming of politicians and people in my life, and a bit less abstraction. There's a broader range of sources as well from which I'm sort of drawing from in the poems. You know, from various books, news articles, social media. It's all kind of in a churning pot or whatever. What else can I say about that? There's just a lot to be outraged about.
There's a lot to be outraged about. I mean, is it worth? I mean, it's work, it's life, it's those. Nothing remains untouched by the disasters. Is that right? And not least your poetry. And you were saying, look, you've you know, since your work is changing under these conditions. You are too. Perhaps you'd read another poem, which is, for instance, New Work Metaphorics, which literally, I guess, speaks to this in its very title.
Yeah, it's the poems. It mentions a blue bottle or a man of war, which is on the cover. That jellyfish enters a couple of poems. It's not like a major like trope or anything, but it's there. Echo. It's sort of there, sort of hovering in there.
Yeah, it's tentacles.
But I guess I was also writing a lot of these poems when I was having sort of disputes over work, and having been in casualization for many years. I battled with my university a lot last year and this year. So there was a lot of activism. I was activated into becoming a bit of an activist on campus as well. And that I think just I think that sort of enlivened some of my poems as well in new ways. But yeah, I'll read this poem, which doesn't explicitly mention Sydney Uni or anything like that. But New Work Metaphorics, it's obviously about work and you know, feeling the need to be everywhere at once. So here it goes. Oh, I should, if you can see this, it's got a kind of a visual look on the page. You don't have to like, yeah, it's, I don't know. Anyway, let's read it. New Work Metaphorics. Feeling new metaphoric. I sublate my long working days into more spatially, cognitively expansive forms, i.e. 24/7. I've got over 73 tabs open in my hot skull right now, one of which on Death Cult Capitalism says, there are more important things than living. And I agree, with the whole of my man-o'-war heart still beating its stung drum. Skeletal, diaphanous, I am traversed by grace, a window pane, and blue. Life comes at you exponentially, so I binge on predicted and rewatchable disasters. I want to die for the world, slated to die this evening. I am its one anchorite at work in ISO, one of its many tiny shadows acting essential at central, and not just thrown by the light of our turned out black star, the curve of whose imploding I will never let flatten me into sleep nor dream.
So it ends on a line, not flattening into dream. There's quite an interesting essay from about 10, 11 years ago in the New Left Review, which was called "Dreaming in Code," from a guy who basically debugged codes for corporations during the day, and when he got stuck, just go home. But of course, even his dreams weren't safe from his corporate job. So he'd start to dream literally in code and dream the solutions to his coding problems, so he could go back during the day. And so even your dreaming hours are not safe from these, I guess, the corporate rapaciousness.
Absolutely not.
One of the other things, I guess, is you're as Tom Waits says, you're innocent when you dream. Although I'm not sure that's true. But one of the things about the dreams too is that you've written quite a lot of dream poems or dream songs in this book, and there's and some of them have been clearly what you call intensified by the folding of our work and our home lives into each other in this kind of weird form of house arrest that's contemporary lockdown, even if it's very unevenly distributed, as we know for various reasons. But it does mean that you have, as I think you put it, pandemic condensation sequences. And I was wondering if you'd be interested in saying something about these dreams and about this poem.
Yeah. Well, I've read a couple of poems from the first section of the book, and this is the last poem in that section. It's a sequence of 15 dreams, pandemic condensation, or dreams refusing to be sonnets. And of course, dreams don't fit into boxes. But they're not just, I mean, they're mostly my dreams that I had, but some of them and fragments of them are like a composite of my dreams, my partner's dreams, and my kids' dreams. We would try to talk about them during lockdown. And I didn't sort of realize until you kind of analyzed it in that way that it's a kind of folding of all our unconsciousnesses together in this kind of weird sort of collective anxiety, like a household anxiety in a sense. And of course, there are larger collective anxieties that are being taken on as well. But there's a lot to say about them. I don't want to bang too much, but like there are some little allusions to some poems that are kind of dream writings in themselves. There's a Dylan Thomas line in there. There's Freud described the process of condensation as like a kind of churning fragments of ice, like glacial or something. And so I guess looking back, I was trying to churn a lot of experiences, ideas, anxieties, repressed desires together to create effects of dreams, during a heightened sort of tense and stress period. I'm also just really interested in dreams. I've got various poems from previous books which are derived from dreams, which I've never made explicit. And of course, those familiar with my work will know that I'm quite interested in surrealism. But I've come
the famous Breton story about when you go to sleep, you put poet at work on the door of the bedroom.
Yeah. Well, I'm quite interested in lucid dreaming in particular, like of late, which is when you become conscious while dreaming. And one thing that can assist apparently in lucid dreaming is to practice prospective memory, which is basically remembering to remember, like remembering to remember to get something from the shops or whatever, which helps apparently connect parts of the brain that need to connect up for you to become conscious while dreaming. And I actually think writing poems is a little bit like that, if you'll allow me to stretch the idea. Like, I rehearse poems in my head during the writing process over and over, and all sorts of fragments get churned up into one poem. The emotional arc of a poem slips in and out of my consciousness. Like, that's always that's never a very sort of stable thing. And part of improving or perfecting a poem is like remembering to remember the emotional arc and all the unconscious levels of what you're trying to write, and finding the language for that, all those levels, at the same time as including all the everyday details.
Yeah.
But yeah, why don't I just read a few of these dreams, because they come actually quite light in the scheme of things. But after all that spiel, I'll start with number 3. I mentioned my daughter Evie, who you just saw, and Tilda, so they get a good mention in this one, and my partner Frankie, so you'll hear their names. We'd just been walking through the empty city. Probably shouldn't have been, but happily didn't see any cops. We needed to get outside with the kids, and hopping over concrete islands without having to worry about cars, listening to our shouts echo, seemed the best way to pass the time, when a skyscraper hovered over our heads. "Is that a real spaceship?" Evie asked. No, Evie," Tilda replied, fake laughing. On a slight tilt, it seemed to be taking its time, like it was leaning over to look for a coin dropped on the asphalt. At one point, it was so close we could see people inside the windows working, oblivious. I didn't recognize the building as one from our CBD, but Frankie assured me that it was. I couldn't quite believe my Star Wars luck to be witnessing this in the afternoon light, its shadows spanning suburbs. It eventually stopped above Sydney Uni, between us and our home, then split in half, a towering cake unable to bear its own weight anymore, and crumbled in slow motion in all directions. We ran from sepia-tinted Broadway with what felt like apocalypse at our backs, then found ourselves with a few other pedestrians in an underground car park. There was dust and panic in the dark on everyone's face, but we couldn't wait to share the photos we'd taken of the cloud that rose into the orange sky, with the skyscraper splintering below into black and grey. 4. This is short. Dawn was fluoro green, and I was a frantic sunflower miming a scream in the middle of a carless King Street. Forget space and the shiny speck of moon rising in the sky's purple eye. No one can hear you in oblivion. 5. This one mentions this animal called a sea gronkle. So shout out to my daughters who watch the Octonauts. There's a particular episode where this very large sea creature gets beached, and it's called a sea gronkle. Anyway, Tilda is quoted in this one, and it begins with her speaking. The giant blue-back spider said, "Get in my home," Tilda recounted. It was friendly, gave her a kiss, then swallowed her whole the way a sea gronkle might. She couldn't remember what smoke smelt like, let alone how to light a fire with wood, and whether that would even work in the spider's big wet mouth that felt like a whale's, like hundreds of slimy snakes, but also like jelly. I was calling for help. Eventually, an alicorn and a unicorn rescued her sorry, embarrassed body by kicking the blue-backed spider in the knees till its mouth opened, allowing her to jump out between its teeth and catch her ride home. One more of those, or should we move on?
Yeah, give us another one.
All right, number 10. I couldn't stop muttering to myself under my breath and over it, and then stuffing the overflow of words into cupboards, boxes, and comments fields, but mostly just into my wheelie bin, which of course overflowed too, the words then collecting in gutters, which I swept up and disposed of in each of my neighbours' bins, and in the bins in the park at the bottom of the cul-de-sac I lived on in Forest Lodge. One of the big trees there, a great ghost gum and my therapist, was explaining my behaviour to me with a flourish of leaves and dropped dew, so I shook my arms about in the air to explain that I was happy and without regret, that I'd been perfectly capable of outsourcing any passionate feelings. At that moment, every bin there and up the street erupted, and all the words I'd been muttering shot into the sky like bats out of cannons. I could feel the dead emotion churning through my waters like some plastic soup in the Pacific the size of Australia. Jellyfish flicked their distress signals on, cigarette lighters wedged in their tentacles. I could smell yellow, and as I gazed up beyond the clouds of bats, I could see my daughters, like space junk, circling the Earth, with the same resentment as detained UFOs shot out into space as if into a void, now dropping back to Earth, as asteroids disintegrating, then crashing through skylights and attics and apartment blocks full of loved and unloved stuff, floor through floor through floor.
Mm-hmm. One of the images in those poems is of Edvard Munch's very famous Scream, right? Which apparently is set on a bridge where the real topography of it is between the abattoir at the time and a mental asylum. And as the animals were being slaughtered, they'd scream, and setting off the mad people in the asylum, who would then scream, therefore setting up off the animals. And this idea of a split, murderous, disintegrating city with a silent scream. It's also like echoing through those pandemic condensation poems. The bins, the waste, the destruction and the disaster, and at the same time, like the unbelievable constraints that this kind of anarchic apocalypse is also unleashing, is also of importance. You mentioned before, for instance, the different sorts of constraints that you're interested in writing the poems. You mentioned, I tried to put up, although I think I should probably clean my camera, the disposition of words on the page, and some of your visual puns. Can you speak about those constraints, the literary constraints that you've used in some of these poems?
Like moving into the second section in the book, there's a lot more linguistic play, a lot more overt, like political satire, and I think the two things worked hand in hand for me. Like I was able to just like lampoon various situations, issues, politicians, speech, public discourse kind of language, and all those things. So I mean, there's a poem called Captain's Cull, as opposed to Captain's Call, which is taking all of Scott Morrison's tweets and using an Oulipo game where you change all the nouns and all the verbs or whatever you want, really. And then I collage it together in ways. So you can hear him there in various ways, but it becomes something else. There's
the kill, the cull, the skull, and all the homophones start to proliferate as a kind of the condensation and remanagement of the tweets through the replacement of these nouns, right?
Yeah. And I mean, at the University of Sydney, we get emails called a message from the Vice Chancellor. And so like I couldn't not lampoon the language in those emails, which are probably not even written by the Vice Chancellor, but he stands by those words, or they stand by those words. And
one of my bosses once said, I sign letters I don't write, and write letters I don't sign.
Yeah. Well, I can sign my poems, but a lot of these more experimental sort of ones in the second section are also monologues in a way. They're sort of other voices, like much more detached than my voice in that sense. So there's this quite a contrast between those poems and the ones which are more autobiographical and stuff.
Would you care to read one of those then, Toby?
Yeah. Well, this one isn't super constrained, but it uses a lot of the public language and imagery that you'll recognize straight away. And for anyone who knows who the head of Tourism Australia was at the time of the Where the Bloody Hell Are You campaign is, you'll know who this is about and what that is referring to. It's called Pink Sun, and I wrote this after the bushfires as the pandemic was starting. Pink Sun. At peak hour, pink sun, black sky, you'll fly back to God's country, though not before your mates have dry cleaned your SUV of ash and drizzle. Looks like it's been off-piste or pissed off for the first time in its life. It's redacting Windows address and quashed the rumors it shunned the inner city craving lunatics who've made the clink between climate change and the champagne flute you blow hot tunes into, charming our cricketers to play through hail or shine with a new ball at peak hour, pink sun, black sky. You can return now for eternity because you stood up with the hell song, hung loose and come out the other sideline without a hose to fan the arson online with. Cooked roux matching the way you beer every burden, yet still leave time to cash in on the outskirts, milk the handshakes of town. Just look at the beautiful housing bubble, blooming and purling as marbled meat at peak hour, pink sun, black sky. You'll fly back for Sydney's sparkling water as soon as there is sufficient smoke to warrant a state of emergence for your massage to be stage managed, not just spun out or rubbed into the streets, bottlenecked as they are with the international think tanks and school kids who can't even go back where they came from, be disappeared as fireworks, gold in the frying pan night, pure, enlightened and woke. How good's eternity blazing across the bridge. Now that was a Bonza campaign, spread like wildfire. Where the bloody hell are ya? peak hour, pink sun, black sky.
Wow. Great poem. I was about to say it makes you want to pull into a Maccas car park, but maybe that's not the right. That's the prime ministerial response, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So there you had the linguistic play, you had the homophonic translation, you had the compression and the sourcing of a number of different political and public communications, right? But that's not all you do, is it, Toby? So we've got the Toby the flaneur, we've got Toby the I guess the prison family man, and Apocalypse, and we've got the political satirist, but there's also a kind of deep an archaeologist as well, or like a psychogeographer too, I guess, in a number of these poems. I'd like you to talk to me about the dogs of Sydney in this.
Well, this there's a poem in the third section called 17 Great Dog Shits in Sydney, and the third section kind of zooms out a little bit. Maybe it's a bit of a bird's eye view. There's more poems. There's some more personal poems. There's more poems like looking at the globe and climate change and colonialism of Australia and history in Australia, in a sense. This one probably combines some of them, but is also just hopefully a bit entertaining. What can we say about it? Maybe the well,
I always think if I was flying over Sydney in a giant dog, things looked bad. Like obviously a classic of Australian poetry, but you know, being shat on by a giant dog from a great height doesn't seem that it seems poetic.
Yeah, it's an odd poem. Like it's so there's a list poem with a whole bunch of colonial facts and capitalist facts about Australia that make up dog shits in a sense. And you know, you've got those Australian kind of sayings, oh, you dogged me, and dog acts and that kind of thing. So it's punning on those ideas in some ways, but of course dogs would hate that. Dog lovers would also hate dogs being sort of completely. So you know, the perspective is shifts in that, like the opening line and the closing line are not necessarily those dog shits. There's an opening line, which is the one you quoted there, which is an entire poem by Michael Dransfield, and then the last line is a line by Elizabeth Riddell, another Australian poet, and they're like the dogs looking back on all the dog shits as well. So there's this, you know, positive negative kind of complicity, you know, also, you know, some kind of maybe link between or relation between introduced species and colonialism and stuff like that. So, but I'll just read it for those that don't know. One of the ones in there that I list is Baron Field. He was he a judge? Justin's written an excellent essay about Baron Field, and I probably wouldn't have written this poem in this way if I hadn't actually read that essay and learnt that stuff. But Baron Field was a judge, was he, or a governor in
colonial judge in New South Wales,
and he had the printing press, the only printing press in the country, and printed the first book of poems, which he wrote himself, and it was called First Fruits. So that was a pretty good big dog shit to begin things off. But yeah, I'll just read the poem. Also, Stones Against the Sky is the name of an artwork which you might recognize from King's Cross, or better known colloquially as Poos on Sticks. 17 Great Dog Shits of Sydney, which is also, I got the idea for this from a Brett Whiteley painting called The 15 Great Dog Pisses of Paris. I was flying over Sydney in a giant dog. Things looked bad. The first fleet had dropped anchor and Baron Field had unloaded first fruits, thus voiding himself of a tax on terra nullius. There'd been a rum rebellion, the grog bog a symbol of progress, and the Queen was back from marking her territory on 57 towns in 58 days. The UTS Tower building appeared as a vertical log some square god had pushed out, while the sporting chicken of John Forbes's bicentennial poem shat itself in Martin Place upon decapitation. The 100 plus kilograms of the world's largest burger were competing with Leichhardt's 1/4 kilometer of pizza, the 2 world records. Mr. Whippy was doing the rounds. Shock jock diarrhea dribbled from the radio, and the NRL got embroiled in a poo in the shoe snafu. Stones against the sky was plopped atop King's Cross. A 12.4 metre puppy left a soiled bouquet at the MCA. Then onion-laced Abbott became special envoy for Indigenous affairs. After Scotty's dirty stop-out at Engadine Maccas, Barangaroo just rubbed it in. Every night, some crusty white cop in Hyde Park pinches off a loaf for the statue of Cook. Now all the dogs with folded paws stare at a glowering sky. Yep.
Yeah.
Should we go back and do the last few budgets?
I think that would be a nice thing to do. Beautiful set of figures, Toby.
I think a link has just been provided for this. This is a poem that has a lot of, I think someone mentioned dad jokes before in the chat, a lot of puns, and is worth sort of maybe reading while you hear it as well, because you can see what's going on. It's just a click there in the chat. Thanks, Alicia, for that. So yeah, I'll just read it. It's called The Last Few Budgets in a Nutshell, and it uses budget speeches going back a few years. And I'll try and get the voice right for this one. Talking about debt is always exciting, but we can nut and muscle not become a carbone cuppy of the Labna putty. I resent to you tonight an extraordinary run of economic joy. No need to spend my knee to stimulate girth, to ward off globular slowdown on a Parthenon to debit free. You have to have a go, to get hit in the ass with a Wayne bow. What I'm swaying is, Barry, the Prime Monastery has my complete confidence. It's imply interrupting bracket creep, and I think the surplus is a goner shtick. However, the disroyalty has been outrageous. We don't do showy teal in the livery putty, shirt fronting on a hectic dais. After all, we brought the budgies back to slurp us next year, the end of the next fiscal sickle, when they lodge wax returns. The grown-ups are in char now. The tragic Tory we're on will fully fund the toxic plan mowing for words. When all is dead and son, we'll be the envy of the world, taxing death and sexting.
Fantastic. I guess we've run the gamut from the personal to the political, the psychogeographical, the psychic. It's now 9:20. We've got another 9-10 minutes. So I was wondering if you'd be happy to answer questions from the quote unquote floor, Toby.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, while those out there might want to think of some questions, I'd be happy to give them a go. I could also mention the last section of the book, which is one long poem. State-sanctioned
depression walks, I believe, is your is a formula.
Yeah, state-sanctioned depression walks, which that's kind of how we thought about them. There's I guess 25 walks that I've written about, 25 kind of prose poems as one long poem, and they're the walks that my partner and daughters and I went on every day or whenever we could, but they were all kind of morning ones. And we went to the Camperdown Cemetery a lot. It was a bit of a kind of haven in the middle of Newtown. I mean, yeah, the poem is much more, it's sort of a much more personal kind of thing. And it sort of reflects the things I was reading at the time, from the Decameron to Camus' The Plague, to just certain kinds of poems and poetry. And there's also this tracking of a lot of flowers and plants, and naming them or cataloging them in a way, because we were, as we all were, we were all made to sort of focus on our immediate surroundings in ways that we hadn't before. And yeah, it's sort of probably the poem I'm most proud of in the book, but it's impossible to read at an event like this because it's long, and it does that kind of hybrid building up of ideas and stuff across the whole thing. So Yeah.
We have a question from Greg Page. Toby, where can we also get the other collections like Rorschach and Gerilderies?
You could probably still get Rorschach from Puncher and Watman. Gerilderies has been, I think the remaining copies were destroyed in a flood in Vagabond's in their storeroom, and I think there were a few unlucky books, not all the books, but a few unlucky ones. And so if I have a few copies left, if you find me on whatever means you have to find me, I can maybe send you one of those.
Isn't the phrase DM me?
Yeah, DM.
There's a great question from Jennifer Compton talking about the Manor War as a colony that can exist apart. And she says, if I remember right, is this something that made you choose a colony that needs each member?
No, I didn't know that about that.
I think can't exist apart there.
That adds another layer. So thanks, Jennifer. I don't know. Some images are chosen unconsciously. I think we all know that as poets. Any poets here in the event will probably be like, "Yep, I didn't know what I was doing with that image." But you have a sense. You have an intuition that certain things do chime, and you know that they resonate with various ideas. But that's the next run, which is really nice.
Mm. It does work in the context of this book. Claire asked, do you write down dream stuff, and she says, I've never managed to keep a notepad by my head and my phone is too bright, or do you just remember it in the morning?
Over the years, I've had real trouble remembering my dreams. Like, they do slip away, and there was a time when I thought I just couldn't possibly remember any of them. But like, I try really desperately when I wake up in those in that half space to keep going over it in my head, and it becomes a rolling narrative that I keep kind of thinking about in my head, and then I try to find the language for it when I do remember it. Sometimes I'm immediately in bed on my phone upside down, that kind of thing, as many of us probably are. Not necessarily with dreams, but scrolling, doom scrolling or whatever. I do that heaps. That gets me in a kind of good mood for it.
But so even your dreams are like waking, sleeping, lucid, not lucid, and sometimes carry from wake to sleep and over several nights, I guess. Nick Croggan asks, Toby, what comes after Spleen?
Oh, good question. I've not been able to write much this year. I had a legal battle at the university, which was very stressful. But I did write a poem the other night and finished it the next day, which was about a wattle tree that was like an omen knocked down in a very strong westerly. It was a very old tree into a new house that we moved into just after we moved in. I wrote some dreams, some new dreams down. So they happen to be in this new lockdown period. They weren't between the lockdowns. There's definitely an attachment between those. I'm exploring like a lot of. I did an essay on endlings, and I catalogued like all the extinctions in Australia since 1788 to show as a kind of essay poem. I'm interested in like what I can maybe turn a book into around the idea of endlings and those kinds of potential connections to other, ending kind of events and things. So I don't know exactly. There's another manuscript I've written which is quite different and about gender and stuff, but I don't know what I'll ever do with that. Who knows what anyone does with gender?
Well, Angelita asks two questions. Firstly, what's your star sign, Toby? And secondly, what's the wildest thing a literary ancestor has ever told you in a dream?
Well, I'm a Sagittarius, but I was 3 weeks late. So I was meant to be a Scorpio. So if I don't like my Sagittarius star readings in the paper or wherever, my horoscopes, I will read the Scorpio and glean what I want from them. I don't know if many of my literary ancestors have visited me in dreams. enough to remember them saying anything to me. They probably said nasty things to me.
The changing light at Sandover. And Claire also asks, do you sometimes have dreams that you write down that are like, no, that's too weird even for Sydney Spleen?
Yes.
Look, we're having a dream run here, Toby. The next question from Jaden White is, hi Toby, how do you take your dreams and notes and make them into fleshed out poems?
Yeah. Oh, thanks, Jaden. One of my students this semester. I guess, like I was saying before, I try to. It's a bit like that perspective memory thing where you try to remember how to remember or remember to remember. I use the Notes app on my phone for most sort of fragments that I write down and turn into poems a lot of the time. Like sometimes I go back through my Notes app and just like pull little lines away and see if they start to collage into something new. A couple of the poems in this book are actually exactly that. Yeah, in terms of turning them into fleshed out poems, I just write them as little narratives, and I try to stick to what I remember being happening in the poem, and in the dream, and because I think that'll have the most interesting effect as a poem. Like rather than it being a poem, it's a document of a dream in some ways. But you know, there's all kinds of little tweaking you do to make it actually read in an interesting way. So yeah.
Look, look. Okay, one last question. How do you decide on the visual form of your poems? Asked Brianna. Do you try a few different visual forms, or do you know how it's supposed to look from the start? I'm afraid this may have to be the last question.
That's okay. That's a tricky one, because the visual, like concrete or vispo or whatever you want to classify them as, calligrams, I like to call them. I kind of like I'll have a poem happening, and then it might not be. I'll have a poem happening, and then sometimes something will occur to me, some kind of ambiguous like notion about the poem, and the idea of putting it into shape isn't necessarily to say, like traditional shape poems, calligraphic poems, you know, this is in the shape of a blue bottle, it's about a blue bottle as well. That gives it that extra layer or whatever of meaning. I'm looking for more ambiguous shapes that will resonate with some of the ambiguities in the poem. And that's an experiment that happens as the writing occurs for me. How do you balance between the political and the personal?
No, we don't go there. We're not going any further down. Thank you so much, Toby.
We're out of time.
Thank you, Alicia. We're shutting up now.
Thank you both of you so much for such a great conversation. And Toby, a pleasure to hear you read your poems. I'm so glad you did the voice for last few budgets. Thanks again to Luke and Ursula for reading their amazing poems at the start of the event, and to the audience for joining us tonight. I will mention that we are hosting another Crowdcast event on the 30th of September with Anne Crawford, author of No Document, and she'll be in conversation with Declan Fry. And that's it. I hope that you all buy a copy of the book. There's still time to click that link at the bottom of the screen. And thank you again to Justin and Toby.
Thank you.
Thanks,
and we'll end it there. Good night, everybody.
Thanks, Justin. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Toby. Bye.